Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining me today for the presentation. We're going to be talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in psychological safety. My name is Brianna Hughes. I'm a licensed professional counselor associate, and I'm happy that you're here with me. So I'm going to start sharing the screen, and then we're going to go over kind of how to interact with GoToWebinar, everything like that, and also if you're having any tech issues. So, perfect. Okay. So diversity, equity, inclusion, psychological safety, there's a lot of content for today. So this is probably a good presentation to save. We have in the handouts a PDF of it. So just to save and look over later, because we're going to be talking about kind of on a smaller scale what these terms mean, and then bigger scale in your organizations, everything like that. But to go over some troubleshooting issues or anything like that, you're going to see a control panel in the top right. When you click on that orange arrow, it's the settings for everything. So you're going to see your audio, how you're calling in, as well as the handout. So there is a handout for specifically tech support. So if you're having any issues, open that up first, see if it can troubleshoot. And then if not, you can actually type into the questions box when you open that up. And that's how we're going to engage in this presentation. And so when I'm asking you for thoughts, or if you have any questions, please feel free to type in there. It's helpful for me when people are engaging, and it also helps the conversation feel a little bit more personal. And if you're having real tech issues and something is not going right, you can type in there, and we have tech support on the call that can chat with you privately on how to do that. So let's see, I think that's it. But if you have questions, of course, just please type into the question box. A lot of people have been to our webinars before, but there are still some people where this might be their first one. So if we could just check and make sure everyone can see and hear me, and you can also see the subtitles. Can you type into the question box? I can make sure that that is all working before we get started. Great, thank you. I'm enjoying the smiles, yes. So great. Also, with the question box, I'm going to be answering your questions anonymously. So if you have a question that you're like, oh, I wouldn't ask this, in person, not because it's rude or anything, but because you're just unsure or, feeling insecure about the question, I can answer your questions, especially on these topics, anonymously. So feel free to add your thoughts. I really want to hear from you because this is a tricky topic for a lot of people. We're going to be going over definitions and things like that. And also, I want to hear from you personally how you interact with this in your work. Okay, so some definitions. Firstly, diversity is the practice or quality of including or involving people from a range of different social and ethnic backgrounds and of different genders, sexual orientations, abilities, etc. Right? So diversity has been a buzzword, especially in the workplace. I mean, since I think the pandemic started, right? But still a lot of people disagree on what that even means to you. And even I was thinking of kind of when I hear it around and like what do you call diverse, right? And kind of noticing, I think of like a group of things. So a combination of things makes it diverse, right? So multiples, not necessarily one thing is diverse, meaning one person, right, is not diverse, but in the context of bigger things. So think about that a little bit, and I'll check in with you later on what you think your definition of diverse might mean. So next, equity, which it was kind of fun looking up a nice definition of this because there was a lot on business and finance. So we got a very short one. The quality of being fair and impartial, right? Equity is different than equality. Equity is more based off of what are the actual needs of each, individual person or organization, not necessarily saying everybody needs the same thing and we're done, right? And then inclusion, the practice or policy of providing equal access to opportunities and resources for people who might otherwise be excluded or marginalized. so such as those who have physical or mental disabilities and members of other groups. And so we're going to go into each of these a little bit more, and how do you actually practice this, or how do you talk about this. But any questions or comments on these definitions, or if you've thought of a definition that you already use that you don't see represented here, you can add that to the question box and we can kind of throw that into the conversation. I'll give you some time. So some examples, right? Diversity is ensuring that historically marginalized identities are appreciated and safe. And so as we're talking today, right, we're including the context of our history, including the context of how systems are built. The workforce is built around a system, right? Government built around a system, all these things. And so we're looking at the context of how these things take place. And diversity is ensuring that people that have been excluded or were normally excluded for long periods of time are no longer excluded. And so later on, we're going to talk about how do you assess in your workplace, right? If it's safe for people of diverse backgrounds, or if there is psychological safety. And so be thinking about those things, and hopefully you're including history as a context. So if we don't learn from history, then we repeat it. And so what's the point, right? And diversity is not calling certain employees diverse hires. And so I don't know if anyone has heard that before. I've definitely heard it before, but it's definitely not a compliment to call someone a diverse hire, because when I hear that, I think they were only hired, it's some person on your team that was only hired to achieve a presentation of, look, we are diverse, right? And that really invalidates everything that that person has done, their work background, you know, how they present as a human. And so diversity is not calling people diverse hires. That's why I talked about, for me, diverse is like a combination of things. A group can be diverse, but I don't necessarily see one person as being diverse, right? The context of that doesn't necessarily fit, or for me, sound logical. Oh, we have a definition. Okay, let me just take a look to read this. Yes, okay, so I guess for the definition of diversity, I'm guessing, someone says they like to include justice and liberation into that definition, because it brings up the fact that we need to look at the structures that are creating barriers. And that's also a really good point too. And so looking at those structures, and when we talk about in your environment, what's psychologically safe, that's what we're looking at as well. What are some barriers to that? Yes. So someone is saying many people do not know the history, so they don't know who is not included or why they have historically not been at the table. I mean, I would honestly say that sounds really tricky, and I would have questions about the high school education system, because I think that's where you start learning about history, right? And so if you feel like some of the history that you learn has left out huge chunks, I would be going back to those teachers and saying, hey, why didn't you teach me about this? Or how are we going to make sure that the generations after us are actually learning, right? But also, we do have Google on our phones. We have computers in our pockets. There are people having these conversations every single day. So even sometimes saying, like, just Googling, my history class didn't teach this, and you'd probably have pages of things of people saying the exact same thing. So I think, yes, it's about who's telling you things and who's teaching you, but also what questions are you asking, and having the advocacy to say, I need to learn about this, or this is important to know. I do not want to be left behind, right? So some really good questions. Let's see, okay, so not seeing the chat. So the question box, you're not able to see everyone else's questions. That's how it stays anonymous, but there is a separate chat box just in case, okay? But that's all right. So that's why I'm reading the questions out to you. Another one, and then I'm gonna move on. Diversity means understanding that individuals are unique and recognizing their individual differences. For example, checkers versus chess. Okay, I definitely see that. So I'm going to move on, and then I'm going to go back to the question box. So moving on to equity, which I wish I had the picture up here, but I don't know if anyone's seen. It's the giving tree, and I think it's such a good representation of equity. And basically it's this leaning tree, and there's apples on both sides, and on the side that's leaning, right, it's easier to get the apples, you can reach it. And so equality would be saying, hey, we'll give two people the same ladder to reach the tree, but one side is clearly leaning. So on the side that's leaning, it's easier to get apples, right? And so equity is saying, okay, on the side that's not leaning over, you need a taller ladder to reach it. And so equity is ensuring that everyone can thrive, right? There are enough resources in the world for everybody to thrive. So equity is saying, okay, where are the gaps? Actually looking at not only just barriers, but actual gaps in comfort, care, quality of life, quality in the workplace, right? Are there any gaps? And then saying, what do we need to do to kind of balance that out a little bit? And equity is not operating as if everyone has the same needs and wants. That's a really hard thing to manage, especially for huge organizations or HRs. If you have to manage as if everybody has the same needs, that's going to be tough. And so if there's any people in leadership on this call, I would suggest kind of sending out a survey or asking, what more can we do? What are those unique needs? And it could be anonymous, right? But kind of reaching out and saying, where are the gaps? And let's hear it from the people that we are serving, okay? Any questions on equity? I know that's a word that a lot of people get stuck with because it looks just like equality, but they mean different things. Yes, okay, so someone said equity ensures that every individual is at the same level. Simple, beautiful. Okay, let me scroll over here. I'm loving the engagement. This is very fun for me. So just give me a second as I look through these so I can engage with you. Yeah, so someone is saying with the, and I can actually go back to it. Let's see. With the term fair in equity, someone is saying that they struggle with that because we know everyone's not given the same resources. So I think that's where the conversation of equity goes to, we know this, and how are we going to fill in the gap, right? We know this, we know that it's not fair, so how do we fill in that gap for people? I'm going to let one more, and then we're going to move on. Ooh, good question. So someone said, how would you recommend furthering diversity in workplaces where the audience is hesitant to acknowledge or accept the impact of historical marginalization? Well, I think that's a really good question. And that's where we look to assessing psychological safety, right? So if you're in a workplace that disregards history or disregards mistreatment, that for me would be a flag of, that feels uncomfortable, right? It's disregarding something that people are being affected by. And so that kind of lessens psychological safety, because if you feel like you have to go into a workplace and ignore something to be comfortable or survive or, fit in, especially ignore something about your history, that's a little bit problematic. And that means that more questions, more conversations need to be had, and maybe getting someone in there for a training to say, hey, here's how you do this in the workplace, right? I think a lot of organizations are trying to figure out, how do you actually have this conversation? Is HR supposed to have it? Do we have, professionals come in here? And so that's just a good time to reach out and say, hey, I think this is happening. Can we have someone, can we find somebody, pay somebody to come and talk if you are not comfortable doing that? But really good question. Okay, so I'm going to move on. Okay, so inclusion is ensuring that those being served are a part of the decision making, and it's also an opportunity for mutual learning. So inclusion, very much. So we hear about organizations that go into a neighborhood or are serving a particular population, but I always wonder, if you're serving a particular population, are the people from that population in on the decision making, right? Especially when we're talking about policies and things that can really affect someone's life. Are they part of the decisions, or is it a group of people making decisions for them? And so inclusion is including them on those conversations so that they have a say, right? Because they know what's best for them. Does that make sense? I think for a lot of people say, we're going to go into this neighborhood, we're going to help them out, they have less, right? But then also there's a lot of questions on, well, what do they need? And people from different backgrounds are going to have completely different answers and also different methods, right? We live in a country with a lot of different cultures. So being able to take that into consideration, knowing that we're surrounded by different cultures, and is that a part of your plan to make sure you're accessing those people? As well as mutual learning opportunities when you have people from different backgrounds, different even educational backgrounds and different systems, then you have more ideas to put in the pot. If everyone is from the exact same background and you're seeing the exact same ideas, it might feel like cohesion, but you have less creativity there. You have less space to try other things. And inclusion is not engaging someone's identity for your own benefit or addressing your comfort level of another's culture, right? So this is where inclusion is pretty unprofessional in the workplace of, if you know that somebody is a Spanish speaker, right? And so this might sound like, hey, I'm so glad that we finally hired a Spanish speaker, now I can practice my Spanish with you, or now you can teach me Spanish, right? Some people think that's completely okay, but I'll let you know it feels awkward on the other side, because it's like, wow, I was just othered for something that's very normal for my life, and now it's kind of put on this pedestal for your benefit, right? And that's just my own example. I was very, very clear about, not adding any stereotypes to today's presentation, because I've seen that before in a lot of DEIs. We're not going to do that today, but I did want to give you an example of kind of what not to do. That could be really uncomfortable for someone. So if you feel like you have conversations with people and you're not sure where it went wrong, or you're trying to engage in their culture, especially if you don't know them personally, right? That might be a good time to work on the interpersonal skills and that connection before asking personal questions about their background, right? Just thinking of, if a perfect stranger asks you something, what's your comfort level with that, right? Okay, I'm gonna check the little chat box here. Okay. Oh, so book recommendation. This is the first book recommendation that I've had, so thank you very much. Someone said, check out Inclusive Conversations by Mary Frances Winters. Okay, I have not read that, but thank you for that. So if anyone's interested, check out that book. Let's see. Someone also said that inclusion is understanding the value of our differences and using those differences for greater effectiveness. Definitely so right. That's what the research tells us, and we're definitely going to get into that in a couple slides. Yeah, so someone's commenting on just American culture, right? And where we're called a melting pot, but are we actually a melting pot? And someone the other day was saying, I think that has changed, right? I think there are some differences that keep us apart. So really looking into, what would you like, your work culture to be? And we are Americans in this country, right? So knowing the history, but also, how do you want to set up your work culture? Part of this training is learning about this and being able to take these conversations and take this information into the next room, into the next meeting, into an annual review, things like that. Let's not have these conversations stop here, because people's voices are very, very important. So being able to grow those voices and work together so that you're not recreating the wheel, right? The wheel it's already been created, and so we don't have to do that extra work all the time. Okay, so I'm going to move on. Okay, so I just love this quote. So inclusivity means not just we're allowed to be here, but we are valued. I've always said smart teams will do amazing things, but truly diverse teams will do impossible things. And so Claudia works for a huge company. I think she's one of the, not the CEO, but a director or manager. And so she's just speaking on how does this actually impact our work? And that's part of her job, is to know that and figure that out so that her teams can do better. And part of what the research shows is that having diverse teams, right, and having diverse backgrounds on teams actually helps your job performance. And so this is why this is so important. So a little bit about psychological safety, and as we get into the research a little bit more. So diversity, equity, and inclusion, the things that we just went over, that creates a foundation for psychological safety. So this decreases the likelihood of workplace microaggressions, harassment, HR violations, which those can be pretty costly if you think about having to send someone for time off or having to send them for a performance-based referral, right? Which I get to see a lot in my job. And so having these values and components, or I guess components as values in your workplace, decreases the likelihood of this, right? And then it also increases work productivity, innovation, we're talking about creativity on teams, and also saving organizational funds. And then increasing employee commitment and retention, which is huge. A lot of people are moving around in their jobs right now, and they're asking questions about diversity and inclusion and equity in the interview. So kind of think about if you're part of a hiring team or part of leadership, how do you let other people know that are asking about your company that this is what you value, and how do you show them that that's what you value? You know, how do you talk about it and how do you act on it? And you know, you want to limit the amount of employees that leave due to microaggressions that are not handled well in the workplace, or you know, feeling othered in the workplace, right? Because there's a lot of job opportunity right now. And then employees are more likely to display resilience after mistakes. So just even simple errors in like a presentation or a project, employees are more likely to come back from that wanting to try again, work harder, rather than kind of pulling into themselves, being less engaging, everything like that. So the reaches go very far, which is very exciting, but also means that people really do need to take this seriously, especially if we're going to change work cultures to where people are excited or okay going to work or don't feel completely burnt out, right? Here are some of the ways to do that. And here are some of the ways to have conversations with your particular employees about that. And honestly, everyone wants to feel connected, respected, and appreciated, right? And so having that as an even, you know, more foundational value is everyone wants to feel these things, and asking yourself, can I be my full self at work? Am I welcomed to collaborate with my team? And so we're going to get into more questions for the kind of assessment of psychological safety, but now is a good time to check in with yourself and be honest, right? If the answer is no, I can't be my full self at work, then kind of see, you know, what part of that self is it? Have I tried? Was I rejected? Was I put down? Things like that. And then kind of giving that as an example of how could we change some things so that I could be my full self at work, and so other people can be their full selves at work. So more impacts. Employees with open minds are more likely to have positive work experiences and cohesion in the workplace, right? And so earlier we talked about people with similar backgrounds. Yes, that can feel like cohesion if everyone's giving you the exact same answer, but that doesn't necessarily help when you're doing brainstorming or you have creative projects, because you have less examples. You have less backgrounds to come from different sides and say, okay, here's how we form a very cohesive, comprehensive solution. If everyone has the exact same answer, you know, it's like how many people can you reach right then, you know? And so looking at your work population and saying, how do we make sure that we have all the creativity that we can access, right? I think this might be part of like interviews as well, and looking at people's actual backgrounds. And then also maybe asking them, you know, like what other qualifications do they want to bring into the room that maybe they haven't brought already. Employees are less likely to engage when they feel psychologically unsafe, right? Which makes total sense. If you feel like you're not going to be heard in the workplace, you're definitely just not going to engage. You're not going to communicate. You might be already burnt out, so you can't actually emotionally care or step towards anybody. And I think that does impact your work. You know what I mean? When people are burnt out, their work performance is not the same. They're less willing to ask questions. They're less willing to even say, hey, this thing you sent me didn't have all the information, but rather perhaps get to the end and say, okay, this whole project it's imbalanced, right? And so looking at psychological safety as first important for employees, but very important for the workplace, extremely important. Psychological safety can predict performance, which I think is amazing, that the research, I mean, I'm glad they're doing research on it, but that it can tell you that so far, right, that it can predict job performance. And so here's why we're talking about it, right? But also, psychological safety takes an organization. Every single person has a part. That means every single person on this call, on this webinar, has a part in this. As you're learning about it, do not leave it here in the slides. Do not leave it here in the webinar. Take these conversations outside, because everyone has a voice. But if you do feel like you're in an organization where your voice means nothing at all, that's already something to pause and say, how do we change this, right? Because you make up the organization, so you need to have a voice there. And kind of when we talk about this, big question that comes up is, what about being trauma informed? And trauma, we already talked about kind of historical marginalization and being aware of kind of those traumas, right? And so I wanted to talk a little bit about just what does that mean, being trauma informed. So trauma informed care overall, it's a framework of beliefs and practices. And so that's understanding the prevalence of trauma and its effect on mental health. As a world, we've been going through a worldwide trauma for 2 years now, 2.5 years. And so understanding that, and I've worked with a lot of people on noticing, okay, what are the effects of trauma that you might be seeing in the workplace? Are they frustrated, or is it the grief and the chronic grief that people have, right? And you're going to see that in the workplace. And so that's also another conversation where if you feel like I need to know more about this, asking your HR to kind of organize a training or have someone coming in, a mental health professional, to come in and talk about that with your employees, because sometimes it's really hard for people to recognize that. We're not really talking about trying to recognize it in other people and tell them when they need to go to counseling, but just saying, wow, this has an impact on my own job performance, on me, I need help, right? And so kind of making conversations about mental health more accessible, because at this point, everybody has been affected. So recognizing short-term, long-term effects of trauma, and we were talking about like the psychological safety. Long-term effects could be, you know, your employee retention just keeps going down, or, you know, the kind of funds, they keep going down. You know, you're not seeing the performance or productivity in ways that you're hoping. That's a good time to take a look at how are we functioning in the organization? What are we missing here? And then also training professionals for different organizations, but training professionals to aid traumatized persons, but in a person-centered approach, right? So that means not blaming somebody for what they have been through, but saying, how can we help, right? And I hear a lot of questions about this from people in HR, because they have a big job of kind of listening to reports, or, you know, if there is someone who's showing like unprofessional behavior, it's like, who's the right person to help with this, right? And so trying to always work in a person-centered approach and find the appropriate professional to work with that employer or work with that team. But it's really, really hard. And so just trying to give a little bit of little bit of reassurance here. And then also, biggie is adjusting policies and procedures to decrease re-traumatization. And so this is why your voice is a really big deal, because if only one person is talking about changing a policy that affects many people, it's a lot harder to get that changed. And so if you notice any procedures that you're saying, hey, this is not, or this conflicts with mental health, for not just me, but for a lot of people, you know, and even if it is just you, just voicing that as well. I mean, that's good information to have. And so everybody is involved. Every single person is involved with psychological safety. Okay, before I forget, I'm just going to check on the question box to make sure I'm not missing anyone. Oh, somebody said they've already heard an example of kind of othering someone in the workplace, saying like, oh, we really like having so-and-so here because they can speak Spanish. I mean, I would honestly just ask them, like, what do you think the response would be for that? Like, what are you hoping that person's response is, right? That is othering them, especially if that's in a big space. Are they supposed to say thank you? It's like that just might, they might have been speaking a different language their whole life, and now you're saying, wow, we've grown because you now speak Spanish, right? It feels a little awkward, at least for me. And so really thinking about, if your brain wants to say these things, please think about them and the impact. Impact over intention, right? Everyone can have good intentions, but the impact can be really, really great. So if you don't have a personal connection to somebody, it's probably best not to just pick out and choose things about their identity that you want to speak on, especially if they're a stranger. So maybe making that connection first. But yeah, so already an example of somebody hearing that. Let's see. Someone said, what programs have you seen that organizations incorporate to engage trauma-informed care? It's a good question. I think because there's a lot of different like national programs, national organizations that have trainings or webinars or like psychological first aid, like certificates and things like that. So it's really up to what is the end goal that organizations are trying to get for the employees, or what kind of training that they're looking for, and then just finding someone, a national program that you trust and that could help out with that. I wish I could remember the name of the organization that does the psychological first aid, but if you look them up, they are really great and they do a lot of work. So even going to one of their websites and looking at their resources, right, that might be helpful, because you don't have to recreate the wheel here. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to go through this slide and then someone has a question about this slide. Okay, so inclusive workspaces, right? So this means a lot of different things, and as some workplaces are getting bigger now that people are going back into work or trying to find more office space, some things to keep in consideration, right? So private chest feeding areas for parents. I think the amount of times I've had to talk with people about they have to use their own office, you know, for any kind of chest feeding, and that's really uncomfortable, or making sure nobody walks in, or, you know, having to use the restroom, hoping. It's like finding the private space. A lot of workplaces do not have this right now, but that's just, I think, an idea that people are talking about, like, yes, let's make this accessible. Gender neutral bathrooms, these are kind of coming into more spaces now. ADA accessible facilities, right? So really, really looking at abilities and making sure that we're not othering people with disabilities. There's a lot of conversation on this right now happening, even for like ramps going into buildings being too steep to where you have to rush up the ramp to even get in there. So a lot of really good conversations on this right now. Captions on video conferences, subtitles. I know that they're like when you have speakers, right? They might not have thought of subtitles, but even asking, hey, when you come in or when you have the presentation, can you add subtitles just for everyone. And you don't have to know if there's one particular person that needs it in the meeting, but just having it there, right? Multicultural holidays recognized on the shared calendars, asking about pronouns in interviews. This is becoming bigger and bigger, and then displaying them in email signatures. Obviously, people can opt in and opt out, but kind of demonstrating like that is a norm and that's okay, right? Offering opportunities for nonverbal feedback. So I thought that this was a great idea because it took into consideration there are not a lot of people that feel fine or even just in that particular space to speak up all the time. And so often they feel overshadowed by team members, or if they're the person on the team that's considered more shy, right, they might not always have the ability to give the same feedback, or might be considered less engaging, right? And so taking that into consideration, saying, is there a way for people to give nonverbal feedback that is valued at the same as just speaking back and forth directly verbally? And then lastly, recognizing multiple languages spoken amongst employees and their families. So here's the difference. Someone had a question about this. Here's the difference between othering and recognizing, right? We know in this country people speak different languages. So on your pamphlets, on your printouts, do you have one language or do you have multiple, right? On your website, do you have a button that can switch to change the language? Do you have trainings that can be taught in different languages? So it's recognizing that without having to point out any particular person and saying, you speak a different language. Because when you other somebody, on the other side of that comment is saying, here's how you're different, right? And that's not helpful for most people. And that's pretty alienating if you're in a group full of people and someone's talking to you or pointing you out and saying, here's how you're different. You know what I mean? Hopefully that answers your question, but it's about the global recognition of multiple language, not just picking out the one employee that you know of and saying, hey, you speak a different language. Hopefully that answers your question. Okay, let me just take a look in here. Okay, so I'm going to ask y'all really great questions. I might save the very, very long ones till the end because they're a little difficult to read. Yeah, but if you can keep it kind of concise, then it's a lot easier to answer. Oh yes, someone said, and making sure that the chest feeding areas are private and not just a storage closet. Yes, right? Privacy and safety, definitely. Okay, so on the aspect of individual skills, so things you as individuals can do or work on or think about to kind of add to these conversations, add to your own workplace culture, is being able to ask for help and normalizing asking for help. And this does not mean that you're incompetent, it's that you can communicate, right? Asking for help is effective communication, and trying to kind of alter that workplace culture. If I ask for help, they're going to think I don't know how to do my job, right? But there are different ways to do that. And on another slide, we have some kind of questions on how to do that, example questions. Feeling supported enough to take risks. You know, are you able, especially if you're in a creative role, are you able to take risks at work and feel supported? Or are you worried about, you know, any type of like punishment or being told you're not following all the right rules, right? And so there are differences there in psychological safety. Can you respectfully discuss difficult problems and issues? Can you speak up when you are feeling uncomfortable? Now, this doesn't necessarily mean in a group meeting, if you're like, I'm not going to speak in this group, but if there was something said, do you have a supervisor, manager, somebody up here that you can talk to about that afterwards in a way of, okay, I just needed to vent, or no, somebody in leadership needs to know about this, right? And finding your voice to speak up. This helps with resilience. We're going to talk a little bit more about resilience later. But valuing and respecting team members' contributions. So this is where having more diverse teams helps. And then also being able to value and respect somebody who has a completely different idea than you, right? And not just discrediting their idea because it didn't come from you. And then also, can you address an issue without criticizing the person? So I know that this is really tough for a lot of people because it could feel personal, and depending on, what your job title is and what your work is like, it can feel personal if someone's saying like, oh, I'm not sure about that idea. Can we change this, right? If you're in a workplace and kind of assessing workplace boundaries, do things feel personal, or is it just in the workplace? And really asking yourself those questions. What boundaries do you have at work so that you don't have to take things personally, or doesn't have to feel personal? Even if somebody wants to, be rude or insult you, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to take that on, right? And so asking yourself a good reflection on, what are your workplace boundaries? And then as far as companies and kind of the company skills and the overarching kind of sense is modeling a person-centered approach in the workplace. So earlier you talked about HR and knowing that how do you help employees but not kind of, what's the term? Not othering them in a way of you need to go elsewhere with that. But if we're like, okay, this is affecting your work, how can we help you? And asking them. And a lot of the person-centered approach is allowing the individual to be part of the planning and decision making, asking them what they need, right? So through surveys, anonymous or not, really having those conversations with your teams. Creating policies and practices that humanize employees, person over production, right? So acknowledging that people have lives outside of those 8, 10, 12 hours that they're at work, and making sure people are taking their breaks, their lunch breaks. The amount of people that I talk to that feel like they get in trouble when they take a full lunch, it's pretty sad. And so how do we change that? You need you need food. I don't know if you can't get any more logical than that, but if you have policies and practices, or maybe the policies say this, but you have a supervisor that's telling you to work more and kind of dehumanize you, now's the time to speak up, right? And just saying this does not match. And then proactively inviting input from all team members. And so here's where you can do this through verbal, nonverbal, individual, in the team setting, all these different ways to access different people's strengths. And then responding supportively, even if inappropriate resources are still being found, so especially for HR, right? Like I might not be, like if you're HR, I might not be the person to talk to about this, but let's find that person, right? So hopefully that's helpful. Just get a lot of questions from HR on how do we do this? So I wanted to make sure that we addressed those today. So in your environment, some questions to think about, right? How to assess current psychological safety. So does leadership communicate about employee strengths or just when problems occur? Does my organization offer learning opportunities about equity and personal development? And if not, I always suggest if you know that there's a budget for training and you're just not seeing it, maybe offering, hey, this would be great, or I found this one, and sending that to them, right? Because it's always great to offer an example of what you're talking about. And that's a really quick way to kind of add that, incorporate that into your workplace, especially for teams. Does leadership turn awareness of inequity into observable and documented change? So do you see actions being taken after you mention a policy change, or does it kind of just go away? And being able to come back and say, hey, I sent you this email about this policy 3.5 weeks ago. Has there been any conversation on that? I would really appreciate a response, right? And are employees expected to compartmentalize their identities to engage better at work? And so this is also part of being able to have that person-centered approach and humanize employees and allow them to be who they are at work and up to their comfort level, right? But making sure that people feel like I can be me at work, and that's not seen as different or other or exploited. Are employees expected to ignore parental, familial, and personal duties while in the office, right? So some workplaces, you're like, my kid is sick, I have to go. And there are some supervisors that are saying, doesn't matter if your kid's sick, I need you to work here like you don't have a family. That just doesn't work anymore, and so being able to speak up when you do hear that happening, right? Does my organization value employees' identities? And so this is also where the multicultural holidays on the calendar, you don't have to know every single person's background, but just knowing in a very visual sense, like, hey, we value a lot of different things here, a lot of different backgrounds, and here's just one simple way how we can do that. Are a diversity of perspectives welcomed, right? When you're working with other people, are your add-ons appreciated, right? Or do you feel like they're consistently pushed away? Does my company's mission statement accurately reflect the workplace? That's a big one. And I always ask people to really honestly read the mission statement and see if your work encompasses that, or if you feel like your environment encompasses that. If it does not, right, then maybe saying, hey, here's what people talk about when they talk about our company, but here's what's actually happening. It's a very quick way to start that conversation. Does leadership challenge unsafe ideas and behaviors? If you feel like work is becoming an unsafe place, please speak up, right? That's part of the job of leadership in HR is to respond to those things. And so if you feel like work is decreasing your mental health, several conversations need to be had then. And are differing experiences celebrated as strengths? And so saying, hey, you're from this background, maybe educationally, or I went here, right, from this program. How do we use those things as a strength so that the whole team and the whole workplace gets to benefit from that? So self-advocacy, always talking about that. But I think this helps in a sense of resiliency. We've had to go through so much in the past 2 years already. And so being able to acknowledge, where are the gaps? What do I personally need? Knowing that your workplace is not going to be able to read your mind, it's just impossible. Managing a lot of employees is really, really difficult. So being able to self-advocate so that you can first practice effective communication, but then actually see those policies or procedures change based on your needs. And so part of that is equity, knowing everybody has different needs, but are we hearing what needs to be changed, right? And so some of the examples on how to communicate your needs is, this is one thing that would help me be more successful in my role, right? How would you like me to prioritize my tasks? I like this one because it acknowledges I can't do everything all at the same time. So how would you like me to prioritize? Who should I talk to if I need more clarification on work assignments? So, and I don't know the nature of everyone's jobs, but you feel like everything is put on you to figure out, even though you do have supervisors or peers, this is a good time to say, okay, I need to talk with somebody, or we need a group here or some support. Who is that person for me? And then lastly, here's one thing that would help me feel less burnt out, right? A really, really good conversation to start, because employers want retention, right? They want people to stay, they want people to be healthy. So letting them know if you're on the brink of burnout or noticing that is a big deal. And there's also a training on noticing what is burnout. So if you feel like that would be helpful for your workplace, ask them to coordinate a training. So some opportunities to foster growth, and these are just some quick, simple slides, but I really like this slide. So it can just it's like a guided, not meditation, but just a guided reflection. And so if you're noticing, I'm having a hard time today at work, or I don't know what's happening, I don't know what's going on, I might be sad, who knows, but you're noticing it's affecting your ability to communicate or in your work performance, just take a look at this. This will guide you through reflection. It'll ask you to think of your body, think of your breathing, what's going on. For a lot of people, they don't know how to do this, right? This is emotional regulation. And so just to have this printout up somewhere in the office workspace, up in the bathroom, right, somewhere in your own little office, this might be just helpful just for those times when you're like, I am not regulated right now, but I don't have time to get into it deeper. So can I just kind of go through something that can help me out for this time? as well as this slide for self-care. So this can just be a good reminder for a lot of people, like, do you have self-care? So I always suggest that you put this up in like a communal space just to remind people there are different things out there, and also to kind of demonstrate, hey, our organization cares about self-care. We will remind you to practice self-care. So I'm going to take a look at the question box to make sure I'm getting to everybody. Okay, so I won't be able to address any personal trauma here, but if you would like to send me a question or email or something like that, or speak to a counselor about that, let me know. A lot of questions on the chest feeding. That's just an option that I used. It was a new one that I saw when I was creating the slide, and I was like, I like that, so that's what I used. So it might be different for a lot of different people. Okay. Let's see. So someone said that they thought that they were complimenting somebody, but it might have been othering, right? And so that might be a reflection after today, right? And it's different for each person. So I can't speak to every experience of othering, but I know what mine have felt like, right? And so just being really careful when you're talking to somebody, and is this, and almost asking, the thing that I'm pointing out about this person to talk to them about, or I'm complimenting them, is that accessible to any person? You know, am I complimenting you on your shoes, or am I complimenting you on something that's only about your particular identity? That's very much pointing out. And if you don't have a good relationship with that person, that's going to feel really personal, right? Let's see. So if you do have any questions on who are the people to reach out to for any kind of HR violations or anything like that, definitely HR, but then also you can ask about meeting with a counselor using your EAP benefits, which you do have, to meet with a counselor to do more of that personal development, personal work, personal processing, and because that's confidential, right? But I would ask your HR exactly what all your benefits are, and also you can go to our website, canitbewell.com. And once you log in, you can see your whole list of benefits. So I would suggest that for anyone that has any questions on, like, what do I have access to as an employee? Okay. So the self-care. So a lot of people have different questions on what's square breathing, tapping. Honestly, there's so many resources through Google and especially through YouTube where you can see somebody explain what it is, and then they'll show you visually either how to do it for a group of people or as an individual. So really just use your resources and search that, find something that works for you. So many guided imageries, so many different meditations. And even for people that are like, I just need to sit and breathe for a minute, can somebody kind of count me through that? All of that is on YouTube. So that's a good resource. Love YouTube. Okay, so wanting to end here on a quote with Audre Lorde. It is not our differences that divide us. It is our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences. And so a lot of today, right, I was reaching out to you all as you are a part of what makes the work culture and what can make psychological safety. So even for yourself, what can you recognize? What can you accept? And then what can you celebrate? And then bringing that into your work culture. You know, that's kind of my encouragement to you all. But we are finished with the presentation today. I just want to say, for any final questions, just thank you so much. I think this was the most engaging question box that I've had. It's a bigger webinar today, and so I'm very, very grateful for all the questions. It just means to me that hopefully these conversations keep going, and feel free to kind of bring this presentation or any slides that you think were helpful and bring that into your workplace or with supervisors and say, hey, can we talk about this? Because you don't have to start over, right? You just have to jump into what's already available to you. Yes, you can share the slide with a friend, of course. There's a PDF there for you, so you can take that. And then as well as if you have any other questions, you can call the number or you can text, and then definitely check out the website. It's a very, very easy way to see what's going on. So thank you so much. I'll be here for another minute or two if anyone has any final questions. But let's see. Oh, somebody asked about a recording. Yes, there will be a recording. I'm not sure if it's just sent directly to you in your email. If you don't get that, then you can email us and we can send that to you. Okay. See. All right. Have a good day. If you're off to other meetings, get some water. Thanks so much for being here. Okay. All right. Thank you so much.